Hey everybody, Author Diary continues, and let's talk a little bit more about world building. Now, I've talked to a certain degree already about some of the more fantastical elements of my eventually to be released novel, Dreams of Fire, when I talked about a little bit about the Fae, mostly through the lens of my original race, the Trescian. This time I want to talk about the human societies that are present because I brought this up in a comment reply. The Fae as presented we don't get a look at their inner workings. And that was mainly a personal call. Nothing really comes from the perspective of the Fae, and that's deliberate because I did not want to mirror them as having a human-like society. I didn't want it to be analogous to anything that is real. To my mind, if the Fae have a society and a structure, it is completely their own, and I don't have enough faith in my own abilities to be able to depict that, so we just don't see it. I did, however, have to come up with the structures for the human society, and particularly today, I'm going to be talking about the power players, the organizations, and the entities with authority. So there's more in the world than actually have agency within the book. The book really only deals with one city-state and an organization called the Science Guild. In universe, there's several others. In addition to the Science Guild, there's also the Alchemist League and there's the Machinist Union. Now, the Machinist Union, they do have a lot of influence, but it's basically their ability to enable other people to do stuff. They're tinkerers, they're builders, and they certainly build a lot for both the Alchemist League and for the Science Guild, but based off designs created by them, with certain things that they aren't privy to so that they can't just start recreating those things on their own. So the Machinist Union, they're around. They're important. They're not really a power player. Oh, there's also the Marshal Service, which is basically law enforcers outside of the restrictions of a city-state, because the cities that exist, there's no countries here. And the cities that exist are largely self-sufficient, some more than others, but whatever they lack, they trade with others. There isn't a lot of power struggle because the land between any given established civilization usually is largely controlled by the Fae, with maybe a few well-maintained roads that you best not be straying off of connecting the city. So there aren't a lot of power struggles. Nobody's trying to consolidate and rule everything. About the most authority you could ever hope to have would be the controller of a specific area, like the arbiter of a city, or the dean of a university if you're in the Science Guild. So now the Marshal Service, I mentioned it in reference to, again, a character who I've mentioned before, Garion, who is a marshal, and they're a bit like bounty hunters. It's a little bit more structured than that, though, because when you say somebody's a bounty hunter, generally that means, hey, bounty on this guy, whoever gets him gets the money. It doesn't work like that. Only certain recognized entities can request a warrant of arrest through the Marshal Service. That means recognized authorities from city-states, from the Alchemist League, from the Science Guild, from the Machinist Union. The highest authorities within those can contact the Marshal Service and request a warrant. And that will empower the marshals to then track somebody outside of where the people who issue the warrant, their authority would normally end. Because, the dean of a university, he does not have direct authority outside the walls of his university. But if somebody has committed a wrong against the Science Guild and is on the run, he can employ the marshals. The marshals are a service. It is called that for a reason. They are at the pleasure, well, I say at the pleasure, they are paid, but they are conscripted to follow others' agendas. By and large, they don't have, as an organization, they don't have their own agenda going on. So that brings us to the Alchemist League and the Science Guild. And I mention them pretty much hand in hand because they are the closest to forces in conflict with each other within the human world. Because as I say, the city-states don't really have an issue with each other as much as humans and Fae do not get along at all. The friggin' sun is changing and the light's going to keep changing in this. Whatever, roll with it. There isn't any kind of organized combat, war going on between Fae and humans. There is a power struggle going on between the Alchemist League and the Science Guild, and that's largely for influence and freedom to do what they want to do and to pursue their particular branch of study. Now, the Alchemist League is significantly older than the Science Guild, and their knowledge is basically, it's an accumulation of tons of trial and error, of cataloging, components, what they do and interact with this, what does this do mixed with this, how do we do this? It is massive libraries worth of trial and error. That is how their knowledge is accumulated. The Science Guild employ a bit more of the scientific method and really try to drill at why. Because for the alchemists, for their approach, they're interested in, okay, what happens when we do this? Oh, so that's the result. Write it down. Let's try something else. They don't really care about breaking down the specifics of why that happened. It doesn't serve their purposes, or at least that's their general mentality as an organization. Now, with the Science Guild, they really try and drill down as deep as they can to find out why something is the case. And that has allowed them to, despite being not nearly as old as the Alchemist Guild, to accrue an awful lot of influence. Their major breakthrough being what are called lightning cages. They're basically batteries. Because due to the way that the Fae protect natural resources like forests and mountains, things like mining and forestry, clear cutting to get lumber, that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do and can't really be done on a large scale. It's done by people who are really good at what they do and are very expensive. So with the Alchemist, a lot of the technology prior to the Science Guild coming around, the Alchemists, they have a branch of alchemy called combustion alchemy, which is exactly what it sounds like, basically creating fuel. So the standard way to get anything moving, because this is a world with, one of my beta readers called it electropunk, so it's sort of steampunk, electropunk kind of technology. There are ships, there are motorized carriages. The question is, what is it running on? If it's running on an explosive alchemic mixture, that's something that the Alchemist League creates. If it's running off of electricity from a lightning cage installed in the engine, something that gets recharged by the Science Guild, then that's something that they provide. And while one is not necessarily more efficient than the other, there is an inherent risk with combustibles that there isn't with the lightning cage. In other words, they can blow up. So once the Science Guild developed the lightning cage, they were able to accrue a massive amount of influence by getting city-states dependent on their power, on their ability to provide them with electricity to be able to do what it is that they want to do. So that's the sort of the conflict between those two. Now, that conflict doesn't actually play into this particular story directly. The Alchemist League is referenced, but actually make no appearance whatsoever. So this is a case where I did world building that ended up being more of a background feature. Now, I was interested enough in the Alchemist League that they are very much front and center in, I guess you'd call it a sidequel book, a companion book set in the same world that If this does well enough, might be the next thing I do. We'll see. I might do something else in between. We'll figure it out. But I definitely did want to explore that, and I've had a lot of fun doing that. But for this story, the Science Guild is where it's at. Now, we deal in a pretty specific branch of study as far as who the players in this story are, and that is the study of elementals, which, if you've been watching these from the beginning, those are the humans who begin to exhibit a very specific primal magical power. And the main character is Ferris. He's a fire elemental. The study of elementals and of elemental forces is in many ways about the closest they can get to safely trying to study the Fae. Because trying to capture and study an actual Fae creature, that's that has not ended well when they've tried that. But getting a hold of elementals gets them access to magic, basically. It gets them a chance to study and try to better understand energy that isn't just man-made by the normal means that they have more proper control of. And the nominal villain of the piece is Professor Rains, who is a professor of elemental humanism, is the specific branch of academia. And she runs a lab that isolates, contains, studies, and experiments on elementals. Now, that's not the only thing that the Science Guild works on or tinkers with. They do have, astronomy branches. They do have botany. They do have people who attempt to study the Fae, as dangerous as that is. So, even though study of elementals, elemental humanism, is the only branch of the academia that the story deals with directly, there's way more than that going on. Now, I couldn't tell you where the concept of the Science Guild came from initially. I think, honestly, I just kind of hit on the name and then built from there. So, their bases of power are universities, which are basically massive tiered metal pyramids. And they have those in a few places, but it is very important that they maintain good relationship with the city-states, because they may be able to create electricity and power, but, they still need food and basic resources and people to come and study. So it is important that they maintain that relationship. The Science Guild has a massive amount of influence, no official power outside its own walls, barring a warrant being issued through the Marshal Service. But that's kind of the thing, is that so often I feel like in fantasy stories, particularly high fantasy, where a whole new world is being created, there's always this background of an ongoing conflict between, whether it be certain countries, certain races, certain forces, and I've got that to a certain degree between the humans and the Fae, but that's not open conflict. That's very harsh animosity, but there isn't a history of warfare there. And I wanted very much with the human society to not have there being massive power struggles, largely because I knew that wasn't any part of the story I wanted to tell. It was always my intention to tell a very ground-level story, but there's still a temptation even with that to tell a ground-level story in this grand, more epic conflict or whatever is going on. And I opted not to do that either, because I feel like, well, if you do that, at some point you're going to need, if you do more than one book at the very least, you're eventually going to have to tackle the greater implications of all this. And again, I didn't want to. I wanted to tell smaller stories just about people and not be dealing with the movers and shakers. So I created a world where there isn't really a reason for large-scale conflict. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but the Alchemist League and the Science Guild, they may not like each other, and they definitely don't, and they do a lot to try and undermine each other, but they're not in any kind of open conflict. There is no reason for one city-state to launch an assault or an attack on another, because what is there to gain from doing that? You'll never be able to properly control the land between these city-states because it's Fey all the way through it. So now you control 2 city-states. So what? It's not like you can just expand out a power base. And it's also worth noting that most of these city-states, while they can do a good job of taking care of themselves, they've basically got the equivalent of a police. Imagine trying to take over somewhere with just the local cops. That doesn't work. Nobody's got an army. And there is sort of background and history that I don't have worked out top to bottom, partly because I'm not into that kind of world building. But there is history for it being deliberately designed in a way that discourages the consolidation of power, because there's a background history of that having been a problem. There's a historical demarcation, and it gets referenced more in the other book. But there's this notion of the old world, that there was kind of a dividing line between the world of some time ago and the world in which we live now. And that largely is centered around the rise and the fall of what is known in the history books and the folklore of this world as the Order of Conjurers. And it's not clear at this point in time how accurate any of the surviving information was on that, in terms of what they were actually capable of doing. Because no one's been able to recreate what they supposedly could do. They basically were like wizards. But there's nobody like that left. And to be very clear, that's not like a hint of, until now, so no. Zip. So there is also part of that history was that the Order of Conjurers did try to consolidate power and to take control on a grander scale. And the eventual dissolution of them was part of what led to things getting set up the way they did. So it's a combination of the organic nature of the Fae are not going to let a human civilization get any bigger than a certain point because it's going to start encroaching on them, combined with the fact that there's actually a historical reason to not have one person in charge of more than one little area, one little pocket of power. I mentioned that it's not the kind of world building I do. Some people, when they do world building, will sit down and just do these massive histories. And I don't work like that. I can't. I lose focus and I lose interest. So for me, the way I approach world building in general is that I will build out whatever part of the world the story I'm telling touches on. It's talking about stuff that happens late in the book. I can't really get into why I came up with the Alchemist Guild, despite the fact that they don't appear in this book. But there is a reason. And then once I had that idea, I started thinking about it, and then actually went and started working on a story more set in that area of things. But I can't just sit down and create a history. But I can create my starting elements, figure out what story I want to tell, and then figure out what needs to be in play and explain what do I need to understand about this world in order to tell the story I'm telling. Which, for me, is just a more natural way to go about it. And I like to think it makes me a little bit more flexible because I'm not going to lock myself in across the board for the entire history of this world. Like, well, it's this because this happened and I know that. Instead, it's like, oh, okay. Why did that happen? I don't know. Well, let's think about it and find out. And it actually keeps me engaged with my world, because if I were to sit down and just world build top to bottom and feel like I'm done, then for me personally, I'd be bored. I'd be like, I'm done discovering this world. What is there more for me to learn? For me, coming up with thinking about elements as I need them is like discovering more about the world. And I enjoy that a lot. So that's some thoughts on world building in general with a focus on the power player organizations of the book. That'll wrap up this one. This one ran a little bit long. I don't know if I completely lost the thread somewhere along the line. Whatever. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next time.